And Pharaoh took upon Sarah. So they were in covenant with the Lord, and he was using the fruitfulness of their marriage, the favorability of their marriage, to bring about the promise of them being of Abram being a great nation. And so that also meant the womb of Sarai at the time was of prominence, of great value, and it was tied to that promise. And so her being in the house of Pharaoh would mean she was a harem, and his harem, she was a concubine. And the Lord's like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I'm sending plagues on your house. Let her go. This might be the first teaching that you've caught. You might not have caught the other teachings that I've done on this channel. Hello, my name is Nikesha Gaville. I am the founder and creative director of Keisha C. Keisha C is a modest fashion brand where we're redefining what modesty is and bringing the true meaning of modesty to the world and what that means. It is also pretty much, just to sum up what modesty is, it is it's part of your character. So it's an intrinsic value that is expressed outwardly, and that's where you get like the clothes, the shoes, and things like that, but it's all tied up into the intrinsic values of your character, which is linked to your identity, which from your identity is where you make all of your decisions, and that all the way down to the clothes you wear and who you represent, who you identify with, things like that. And so yeah, so we are redefining what modesty really is, because right now we have a view, and we've been conditioned with a view of socialized modesty. And socialized modesty is very different from the actual true meaning of modesty, what it means, why we have it, why we were born with it. If you want to know a little bit more about that, view all of the past life teachings that I've done, specifically the one titled Genesis, the beginning, and that'll kind of let you know exactly like how modesty started, where it came from, how it formed, and then also how we've taken on this socialized view, this constructed view of modesty. Hello everyone, we are back for another live teaching. So we're going to do part 2 of the Pharaoh versus Abraham. So we talked about part 1, and that was focused on the remnants. My notes are over here, so if you see me looking this way, that's because my notes are to the side of me. But yeah, we're gonna just jump right into the teaching. Again, the first part was about the remnants, helping you understand who the remnants are, what the remnants are, why Pharaoh is coming to ravish the remnants. You have to understand what the remnants are, who they are, what remnants mean, the symbolism behind it, and also like the literal meaning behind it as well. And then for you to understand that, then it'll help you understand this second part of the teaching, which is going to talk about, first of all, we're going to start a little bit more about Abraham, the significance of his life, and also the events within his life, within this portion leading up to what happened between him and Pharaoh. And so where we left off is we talked about Abram. We went down like the full lineage. So we pick up and also referencing Genesis 12, chapter 12 for this teaching. And so if you have your Bible, so we're identifying the pharaohs of the time. So Pharaoh has been around for centuries, right? And we kind of talked about that within the first Pharaoh teaching, when we talked about Pharaoh versus the Israelites. That was our first case study. And what this series is, along with all the other series, but specifically this one, is really helping you to identify the pharaohs in the land, the pharaohs that are rising up, and the pharaohs that are already present, right? And Pharaoh is not just a authority, right? It's not just a seat or a place of authority, or I should say a seat of authority. They always think about the man Pharaoh, but it's a lot more complex than that. It's actually a system. It's an oppressive system. It's a system meant to extract, drain, and also make sure that you never survive, that you never get out of it, right? And so with that, we kind of broke down like the layers and the nuances with Pharaoh, because Pharaoh's not just this powerful rulers, or just rulers, right, from family that was like dynasties for centuries, right, that ruled in ancient Egypt. And then the first live teaching that I did, we kind of dived into that. Pharaoh was more complex than that, way more complex than that, because it was through an altar. And so we kind of touched on what an altar is. We kind of touched on ancient Egypt, how they gained their notoriety, their prominence, and their power was all through their religion. Their religious practices guided their way of living. And so, they served over 2,000 deities. And so they had a lot of rituals, a lot of dedications, a lot of just things and offerings and things that they gave to all these deities, because each deity represented a different part of life, different part of thing that they wanted or needed. And so they had to do these consistent rituals and things like that. And so the system of Pharaoh is very complex and nuanced. I won't get too much into it because there's a whole teaching that I've done with that. If you really want to start from the beginning, you can start at the first live teaching we did for identifying the Pharaohs, which is Pharaoh versus the Israelites. It breaks down all of that. It gives you a real deep, in-depth view of ancient Egypt and everything, and why pharaohs are rising, why they're still here. This we're talking about, and that specific pharaoh was for a specific time, not only a specific time, but it was wanting a specific thing. So with pharaohs, it's always acquisition. So anything, and when it comes to rulership and dominance, will always be run by money. I always tell everyone I know, if you follow the money, you know exactly what's going on. And so all of this is run by or facilitated through acquisition, acquiring something. And so each pharaoh that we go through, there's always acquisition involved some way, somehow. And it's actually more deeper than just having more power and dominion. It's actually deeper than that, right? And so with this pharaoh we're talking about the pharaoh that's coming to ravish the remnants, right? So you can watch the first live teaching for the part 1 that I did about the remnants, and I kind of went into all of that. Today we're going to talk more about and get more into the case study, which is Abraham versus Pharaoh. So we're going to start with Abraham, and we kind of went down his lineage too in the last teaching, so it'll really help you understand this teaching. So I would pause this, I will go listen to the other one, and then I will come back, because it'll really help you understand this teaching and then the last teaching. So I broke it up in 3 parts. So the last teaching that will be of this. So we're going to start with Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 5. I'm going to just pull out I have my Bible right here. I want to just read it so you can kind of know and help you follow along with what's going on, okay? So this is after Terah has died, Abraham's dad, and so they're all in Haran, right? And so it says, chapter 12, verse 1 through 5. So now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So then they end up getting to Canaan. So Abraham was Abram, right? So his name changed further into the commissioning. So this is the commissioning of him. So if you think of commissioning, this is being set out to do something, right? You're being sent out to do something. And so when we talk about the journey of Haran, was really the beginning, from Haran to Canaan was the beginning of his commissioning. And I kind of did a little bit of research on because they were coming from of the Chaldeans. So when you hear the Chaldeans or other countries, especially back in those times, that means that region was named after its inhabitants. So a lot of the Chaldeans, which was a nation of people, a group of people, lived around that time. And then also, if we really want to get more deep into it, I won't get too deep into it, but like the Chaldeans and the land that Abram was in was all kin, like they were all family, right? They had great lineage already. So yeah, they were all family, but we won't get into that. I've got into that in the other teaching. And so a little bit about was from my research that I gathered. Well, first of all, there was two opposing views, because there was some believed, and then there was also this great archaeologist, I can't remember his name, but he did some research and also had, like, you know, they had different sites where they did some digging, and so they were saying that was like the lower part of Mesopotamia, which was like an ancient nation. I can't remember, but I think it was like what would be like modern day Iraq, right? Kind of in that region and area. And so they were saying they did some some archaeologists came, they dug, and they had remnants, and was shown remnants of different things that back up what is mentioned in the Bible around Abram's time, right? And so, but I had read some other research in context where they kind of were debating, like, oh, I think this person was misinformed, and so they're trying to say that was maybe like more northern. I don't know, opposing views, but what I did find out was that was a very wealthy, rich city, like very, very wealthy, very rich. They had trading, they were good in engineering and farming and manufacturing, textiles. They did wool and flax were like the top textiles that they were known for. However, and they kind of remind me of ancient Egypt, right? Which is so funny when you think about how Abram like skirted off into Egypt, because when I look at some of the context of what I was looking in research with like, it sounded just like Egypt. When I broke down with the first live teaching of ancient Egypt and how they were good at all these things, and they were skilled craftsmen, and they had these inventions, and they were polytheistic, because also in they were polytheistic, meaning they had more than one religion, like they were able to serve more than one deity, right? And so the people of they worshiped thousands of deities, polytheistic. And it also was a cultural hub. So with it being a cultural hub, it wasn't just not only like trade and farming and engineering. That's how like they gained their prominence. But with it being a cultural hub, that means it had so many different cultures and tribes and nations within it, and that's why they had so many deities that they worshipped. It was just like, like they call it a metropolitan area, like very vast, very robust, very advanced for its time, especially back then. Even like when I was looking at some of like the buildings and how they lived, and I mean, they were living in like two-story houses, which like from the pictures, they look like the townhouses of our days, but a little bit different. And so, yeah, they had a temple, or it's like a temple tower, or it's called a ziggurat, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But the deity over was called Nana. It was the moon deity, and so that's the main deity that they served. And they had the ziggurat, which was tall, and they had temples, and it was saying even in the temples there was like agriculture, there was cultural things learned. They had like schools, and so you kind of really learned the art of serving the deity by way of like the responsibilities that they had to carry out in society. So that's how they raised the youth is within these temples, to learn about all these cultural references, to then like pass on that. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. It also, again, they had 2-story houses with open courts, and these 2-story houses had like 12 rooms. It had like I don't know if you've ever been to like Morocco, Saudi Arabia, but they usually have like an outer court within the inside of their home, where it's like there's like open sunlight, there's plants. It's like very beautiful. When I went to Morocco, being able to just see like the homes were beautiful, and like how they had like an outer court, and it had like plants and flowers. It was just really beautiful. So they had like that where it's like there's 12 bedrooms. There was normally 2 to 3 bathrooms, washrooms, but they had like an outer court. Like it was very beautiful, but very prominent land. And yeah, what I also found out, and this is also according to Jewish tradition, so some of this stuff, his research, some of it is like Jewish tradition or what they, the Jewish believed, but it was said that Abram's father, Terah, that he actually was, like he bought and sold like idols, which means like the figurines, because some of, like, I don't know if you go to like a nail salon sometimes and you see like the figurines they have of like Buddha, whoever that they serve, right? It's like that, like he was like a trader and like a buyer and a craftsman, crafter and craftsman of those kind of figurines that people use for idol worship and for things like that. That's what they say. Do I know? I don't know, but that's what they say. And so, yeah, now we're gonna kind of get into the conversation about how he got to Canaan. So with Canaan, there was the next phase of the promise. So when you think about in the other live teaching that we did, we kind of went through the lineage, right? Of every patriarch that was assigned or just given the responsibility of carrying the covenant and carrying the promise forward through that generation. And that was 10 generations leading and with Abraham, right? And so him being commissioned to Canaan was like the next part of the promise, like the next phase, but it also was just the commissioning of him to be sent out, right, to do whatever he was called to do. And so we kind of understand also why God had said in Genesis why he wanted him away from your father's house, away from the land, and to a land that I would show you, because at this time, there was a lot of just heavy witchcraft, heavy idolatry, like just a lot of practices and things that kind of went against a lot of the laws and legislations and commandments that God had set. And so, he needed to take Abraham out of all of that, right, to be able to get to the promise, or the next phase of this promise. And so also within this story later on, that's when his name Abram turns into Abraham, as well as his wife's name Sarah turns into Sarah, which later on. And so next we're going to kind of talk about the key aspects to note when it comes to this commissioning. Excuse me, I'm just going to drop that. I tried to do something different in terms of setup with my notes, and it's just not working. It's giving such a glare and I can't see, so I'm just gonna adjust. So when we kind of look back also on the lineage part, what we did in the previous teaching, and really look through Abraham's lineage, it really breaks down the remnant, but also kind of shows how even Abraham, as I mentioned, the Chaldeans were of his family, were of his kin. Necessarily when we go back up the lineage to the first patriarch, right, which was Noah. We talked about the great flood. And in history, throughout every religious organization or religion or culture, they always talk about the Great Reset, right? They might call it a flood, they might call it something else. Some people call it the Ice Age, some people call it a lot of them call it the Great Reset. But so Noah kind of was the patriarch, right? And then his son Shem was chosen. And so from Shem came all of what they call Semitic people. So with this, it's like a cultural people. I say that because it wasn't just Chaldeans. Like there was Chaldeans, there were Hebrews, that was like all of these people. There were Elamites, Assyrians, Arameans, and also the Israelites. And so through Shem kind of came the father of all of the Hebrew people. And then from that birth, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, which is where Abraham was stationed when he was in was around his family, right? Extended family. And so when we talked about just in the commissioning that I read, chapters 12, verses 1 through 5, this was kind of the beginning of the divine separation. Now, throughout his lineage, because there was, again, 10 generations, there was already separation and things happening. I kind of broke down what each lineage, meaning each generation, what that meant, the signs and wonders. And that's something you have to kind of think about when it comes to the pharaohs, because there's always signs. Like, not only is creation, meaning the earth, is foretelling and showing of signs, but then there's also physical signs, there's also spiritual signs. So there's a lot of signs and things that you kind of have to read into to really know and understand what is being communicated and what is being shown. And so yeah, this was a call for the great separation, right? A divine separation. And then also it was like he had to follow the spiritual signs, right, and the natural patterns, which is something of the other patriarchs within his lineage did, right, that came before him. And so as it relates to the stewardship over the family, so with this promise, with this covenant that was given to Noah, there was specific stewardship, right? There was authority given over the family, but also like it had to be obedience. So there's kind of like a twofold thing that was coming on, because Noah was saved, right? So he was like the beginning of what you would call a remnant. He was saved through Noah, and Noah's devotion and how Noah found favor, was favorable in God's eyes. It saved his family. Now his son Shem was kept due to Noah's devotion to God, right? And now Shem means, renown, and is the father of all Hebrew people. And so I'm getting ready to break down a little bit about Abram's life and journey in chapter 12 and how then it relates back to his lineage, right? Because I said each patriarch that was chosen, which was a son, was for the next, each generation, right? And we have 10 generations when we get to Abram. So with that, through this commissioning of verses 1 through 5, we're going to see also just in chapter 12 in general, how even the signs of the patriarchs that came before him, that was a part of his ancestral lineage, how even their specific signs and natural patterns within that generation still continuously played out throughout Abram's life, right? And so you have Shem. Let me just get that. So his name means renown, right? He's the father of all Hebrew people. Again, we go back to the promise that I just read. Now, Abraham's promise was that his name was going to be great, meaning exalted and distinguished. That is what Shem, his ancestor's name, means, right? It said that Abraham will be a great nation, and in him there was a decree that all families and nations of the earth will be blessed through him. Now, if we talk about Shem, his name means renown, and it also, he is the father of all Hebrew people. So you see how the parallel of Shem, what he meant for the generation, what he meant as being a part of the connection and promise, and how then that even played out to Abraham's life. Now, Shem's son, now they all actually had other children, but there was specifically one patriarch chosen. Now, Shem's son, Arpachshad, right, there was no specific meaning to his name, but he was a prominent, again, patriarch due to his obedience to the covenant, right? And so what this signified in Abraham's life, right, was Abraham's faithfulness and obedience, even in the midst of idolatry. Now, when we talk about Arpachshad and all the rest of these, this is also when there was a great divide within the family, and how they all became scattered and became other nations, other tribes, and actually spoke different languages, right? Because for the most part, they were all speaking the same language. But then the Tower of Babel happened, and you can review the previous teaching that I did that kind of goes depth into that, right? But even in the midst of idolatry, the deity worship, all this stuff that was going on, Arpachshad still remained faithful, right? And due to his obedience, he was selected as a prominent patriarch to carry over into that generation. And so what that looked like in Abraham's life, with Arpachshad being his part of his lineage, was Abraham's faithfulness and his ability to preserve the covenant, because Arpachshad had the ability, due to his obedience and faith, to preserve the covenant, right? Now, I'm going to read 12. I'm going to read Genesis 12, 1 through 3 again, before I go into Shalach. So from Arpachshad, his son Shalach was chosen. And again, I'm showing you through the lineage what the natural signs and patterns of each name, because even when I was researching the names, and I had mentioned this in a previous teaching, that all of the names of the patriarchs I'm getting ready to tell you, they all mean something. And it's deeper than just being like, oh, that sounds like a good name, or that sounds like, wow, I didn't know that name meant that. Like, no, their name meant something, and their name was also a sign. Their name was the foretelling of something. Their name marked what that generation would experience, and what the sign of that generation would experience, and how close they were to the promise, right? Now, the full promise that did come to pass was that a Savior would come, right? That Jesus Christ would come, and he would save and, die on the cross for everyone's sins, and everyone be restored back to the Father in heaven, right? So the thing is like, there needed to be a pure lineage for Jesus Christ to come. Now, Jesus Christ didn't come till, I believe, I can't even remember from my research, but like years down the line, right? However, there needed to be, there was a covenant with Noah. Noah was saved as part of the remnant, because there would be a bigger remnant being saved continuously throughout generations, so that then eventually the Savior could come, right? And so let's go back to Shalach. So when we read Genesis 1, he says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all families of the earth will be blessed," right? Now Shalach was a patriarch, and Shalach is also Shalah. It's also Shiloach, Shalom. So there's several root derivatives of this name. But what it means is patriarch. It means sent, sending, to send away, to send out, or to send for, right? And so you can see how this played a part in Abram's life, right? Also, the root derivative of Shalach is Shiloach. And also aka Shalom, and it's actually a fountain in Jerusalem, right? And so this Shalach had a double sign, a double meaning, because it was not only the sending out. So you can see where I read in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, how Abram was sent out, right? He was sent out. He was sent out to a place. Also, it talks about this fountain of Jerusalem based on the derivative of Shalach's name. And it says that it is a hidden channel within Jerusalem that was preserved, and like there was like the same outflow of the pool, and how it was safeguarded, right? And then with further research, it also then became a place for priestly, for the priests to draw water from during the Feast of the Tabernacle, right? It was also the same fountain, the same channel that Jesus, right, that came through this lineage, commanded the blind man to wash his eyes. And so you can see how Shalach is not just only a patriarch of covenant, of keeping the covenant. He's not only, his name doesn't not only means to be sent, or to send out, or it means sending or send, or sending away, or sending for, or sending out, but it's also a hidden channel that was preserved. And so when you look and think about how that relates to Abraham, right? Because even as we're just in Genesis 12, right? So this isn't even like half of his story. This is just the beginning of his story. How even in the beginnings of his story and his commissioning, he was sent out and away from his family, right? And also with him being sent out and sent away, he was also a hidden channel, right, that was preserved, right, and safeguarded by this other pool of water. So you say, like, well, who was the pool of water, right? It was God, right? Abraham was a hidden channel, being able to move, right, through a location, settled in a location, right, which was Canaan, right? And yeah, so it kind of talks about also this channel being something throughout history of not just it just being there, but throughout history within the context of Abram's family for lineages down the line, something that eventually even his lineage would be used to usher in Jesus Christ, and that be the very thing that Jesus used as a miracle to heal the blind man. And so this hidden channel that's being preserved and safeguarded is also the very streams and flows of a body of water that generations to come can draw from, right? Can rely on. And so it's actually kind of cool when you think about it. It also kind of shows just like the practical trust in the season of threat, and also an unseen tunnel of providence is already directing life. And so it kind of talks about and illustrates how God, right, is the unseen tunnel of providence that's already directing the flow, right, the constant stream of flow of provision to this hidden channel, right? And so Abram's obedience gave way for the priest and Shalak to exist, right? Not just, his past patriarch, but also future wise. He was also the one to carry the covenant forward, right, for the promise of Jesus. And Abraham's trust in God to leave Haran for Canaan, where he was commissioned, made him also the unseen tunnel. When we talk about the unseen tunnel, sweeping through providences, right? So in his commissioning, and we'll kind of get into it because he was commanded to go in different places, right, and make altars in certain places. And so he was kind of this unseen tunnel, kind of sweeping through providences, making his way, and having the direct life of God that continued to supply him. Now I'm going to read on from verse 4 to verse 7, and this will get into the second half, which we come to the other patriarch. So from Eber, his son Aver, was chosen, right? And so I'm going to read verse 4 through 7. So it says, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abraham took Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. And it says, and so they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the timbereth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were there in the land. It says, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Okay, so now you'll say, like, how does this relate to Aver? How does it relate to the patriarch? So Aver means Hebrew. Aver also means region, beyond, side, other side, across. It signifies a legal marking, right? A legal boundary, right? That must be either crossed or that is a passage. And so when you look at verses 4 through 7, it actually illustrates how the patriarch Aver was assigned in the early beginning commissioning of Abram's life leading up to this great tension that he will experience with Pharaoh is because he had to go out, right? He had to go to another region. He had to go to beyond the other side, excuse me, of where he was in Haran to Canaan, right? So there was a legal marking, and the legal marking became in verse 7 where it says that, and then he built an altar to the Lord. And so we kind of talked about altars. We kind of talked about the altars of ancient Egypt and the deities that they serve. So when we talk about deity worship, when we talk about idol worship, a lot of these deities and things like that, so you need an altar, right? So they did a lot of sacrificing. So they did a lot of blood sacrificing, whether people or animals. And so every altar, every deity that is served, there's an altar, right, that facilitates that worship, right? And so with the altar, there is a sacrifice. Some people sacrifice people, some people sacrifice animals. And then how that altar is manned or, guarded is through priesthood. So when you hear a lot of people say like, oh, they're a high priest or they're a priest, or they appointed spiritual leaders or spiritual priests over something. So the priest then mans the altar, whatever ritual, whatever needs to be done, the priest is active in that ritual to ensure that peace and harmony with whatever the demands of the deity requires. And so when Abram came to this specific place, this was the first place that he came to, he marked it with an altar to the Lord. And so that this place became a legal marking, right? It became a legal boundary to the Lord, right? Now, mind you, he was coming out of places that had already had legal markings and had been legal boundaries for other deities. For I talked about in Nana was the deity. So there was legal markings. That ziggurat, that temple that they built unto that deity, the practices that they instilled culturally, even making it like not just a temple of worship, but a temple of learning, right? To learn the craft, to learn the history, to learn the culture, to cultivate children up in that so that they would take that on, right? So that was a legal boundary and a legal marking. So when Abram made this passage, right, he went beyond the region of where he was at in Haran to Canaan, and made his first legal marking and legal boundary. And so Aver was the household chosen to birth the nation of the Hebrew people. So we had Shem, when we talked about earlier, was the nation overall of like all the people, right? All the Semitic people, where it had various nations and cultures. But Aver specifically was the birth of the Hebrew nation. This was the identity, right? So when you talk about a legal marking, it can also be a legal marking of identity. So this is where the identity was birthed into the Hebrew people. Now, yes, they were already there, right? They were already formed. We talked about Shem, like him being the father of all them all, right? That's what they called him, the father of all. However, Aver, the patriarch Aver, marked the identity of the Hebrew people. So that was key and significant. And you can see it here even in verse 7, where Abram, his first voyage, when he came to the land of Canaan, he went to a specific location and he marked that location. He gave that a legal boundary and a legal right to the Lord, right? And so you also look when you talk about Aver being the identity birth for the Hebrew people, right? You think about how that signifies even the promise to Abraham, where he was promised that all households, all of them, all the households of the earth would be blessed through him, right? And so it kind of also shows how his name is referenced to his descendants. And so Abram, him having to cross over into Canaan, right? He had to cross a region beyond his native home. He had to walk, through a passage and go beyond, right, on the other side of what he knew in what he knew in Haran. He had to leave all his family. And so this kind of also signified the legal marking and also spiritual boundaries, just even in his journey and passage, right? Because when you think about a passage, there's so many reference points. Like I think about even like trails. Sometimes when I would like walk trails. I think about so many reference points of like, there's a tree here, and this specific tree or this specific flower or this specific whatever it is a marking for this specific area. And so just kind of think about it like that, like even the passage that he took, right, the crossing of regional boundaries. And when you think about most of these cities have been legally marked or bound by other deities and deity worship, and so he's having to cross these borders that have altars and temples and worship to deities, and he's crossing over into a land and marking that territory for the Lord. So that's how he gets to Aver, right? And again, this is just like literally in the beginning of his commissioning. So then we're going to, I'm going to read verses 8 through 9, and then we're going to get to the next patriarch, because Aver, his son Pelag, was chosen. And I'm going to tell you the significance of Pelag again, and how that relates to Abram and his journey in his commissioning. So verse 8 says, "And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south." Okay. Excuse me. So Pelag means division. It means to divide, to split. It also means stream and channel. And so we kind of talked about earlier another patriarch's name meaning a hidden channel. So Pelag also means channel. It's a channel of water that represents life. And so the Lord had kind of already gone out before the children of Israel in the camping of their land. So there was like separation, there was division, and there was like allotment of land, right? Of what would be within the means of their provision. So when we think about the promise, it's like God already kind of knew. He told them, like, he told Abraham, I'm going to give this land to your descendants. Like, this is the land for your descendants. So there was already an allotment, right? This land in Canaan was already set apart. It was already divided. There was already a divine separation, right? And the space, all of the areas and different areas, and there was a specific allotment given within this land. And so that's kind of what Pelag is showing in verses 8 through 9 is the great separation of the land, the divine separation of the land. Again, we talk about the idol worship, the deity worship, all of just the other perverse practices, right? And so there was a land that had to be divinely separated. And so you think about in terms of also what it means is the provision of being sustained by God. So it was already separated by God, but how was this land being sustained by God? So Abraham, again, Pelag means stream or channel. And so you kind of look at Abraham as he's venturing through this land, marking altars as he stops, right, along the way, dedicating back to God. Abraham was that stream. Abraham was that channel. He was like Pelag, meaning the stream and channel. He was Pelag in terms of the stream and channel that was moving throughout the land of Canaan, right, creating markers, creating altars for the Lord, dedicating the land back to God, right? Which would then be the generational inheritance of his descendants. And so God had already gone out before him and did the allotment, did the divine separation. And then this is how Abram was used in terms of the patriarch Pelag, where it comes to him signifying him moving out, him being sent out, and the division that happened, right? The separation that happened, but then also Abram being used as a stream and channel moving throughout the land, right? So kind of some things to reference is that Abram had divine purpose and the anticipation of cleansing through the separation that happened. So amid cultural shifts, societal fragmentation, there was corporate grief, there was also breach of covenant and brokenness. So this is also, Pelag is around the time that after the Tower of Babel happened, where pretty much, quick story, very short, Abram's ancestors, they just started thinking too much, a little bit too much, right? Doing too much. And they was like, boom, so we gonna go to this land, right? It was unmarked territory. So I don't even know what they were thinking, but they went to this land and was like, and we're gonna build a city, right? And we're going to, in this city, build a tower that would go all the way to heaven, right? And so it talked about how God was talking amongst, him, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus, and he was like, oh, if they build this, like, they'll be successful in building it. And it also mentioned how they had one language, so they were all on one accord, they all spoke one language, it's all one culture, right? So what God had to do was, because if he allowed them to continue, then they would have been successful in building the tower to heaven. Now you ask, like, how did that happen? You'd have to go back to Genesis, right? There's a live teaching I did in Genesis that talks about how all this came to be, like how all this crazy stuff came to be, right? Why the flood even happened in the first place. It's a lot, right? So he pretty much scattered them across the earth, scattered all of them across the earth, changed their language, so they all began to speak different languages. They could not understand each other. They all started birthing different nations and different cultures, because now they all have been scattered. So when you think about it, they were all family. Like, when I say they were all family, they were literally all family. And so at this time, there's also a breach of covenant, because they were called to be holy, right? They were called to be separate. There was already a covenant that came down from Noah. And now, mind you, Noah is still living at this time too. So I do want to point that out. Like, I mentioned Noah, I mentioned Shem, they're still living at this time. So they're all experiencing this corporate grief, right? Of brokenness, because a lot of their family have gone out and started just doing some crazy stuff, right? So there's this cultural shift that's happening. There's societal fragmentations that's happening. So it's not just also Peleg is not also just Abraham just being sent out. There's a separate land, but also at the same time, even though, and we're talking about in the realm of things, the Tower of Babel had already happened, right? But there was still separation. Like, they were still scattered. There were still different languages. There were still different cultures, and there was still corporate grief and brokenness over the breach of covenant. Because if you think about it, there was one patriarch chosen, one, to carry on this covenant, to carry on this mantle of responsibility, right? So that means that a lot of their other family was just out here just doing whatever, right? And so just think about the kind of the grief and the brokenness of, like, I'm having to keep this covenant, I'm keeping this responsibility, this duty and diligence, but my family is lost, right? They've broken the covenant. There's been a breach of covenant, and so there's brokenness, right? There's punishment for their sins and things like that. And so that's all that stuff is kind of going on. But it also kind of shows how even in the midst of that, there was still a divine supply, and how Abram had servants, he had animals, he had resources. I mean, he was very well taken care of. He had a lot for himself. So there was still divine supply. There was still divine provision. And so Abram had to be separated from his home. Mind you, there was already land separated specifically for Abram's descendants, right? And so God had to separate Abram from his home, right? And in separating him from that, think about also, like, Haran is where his father died, right? So his father never made it to Canaan. And so thinking about kind of like the tension, the good tension, and like the pulling of what Abraham must have felt, because now he's having to leave not only the land where his father brought him to, but the land where his father died, right? And family that was in Haran and nearby, and completely have to be separated from all of that, right? And the fact that even though his father died there, that he didn't stay there, and so, and then later on in the story, how Peleg even shows up even after they leave Egypt, right? That Abraham and his cousin Lot had to separate. They had to be separate, right? So even it came to Peleg, there being a divine separation, even in that of, like, okay, now going to this next phase, like I need you separate from that as well. And so this kind of shows how Abram is used also not only as the separate, like there's a separation, but he's also used, because Pelag means channel, right, and stream. He's also then, with his separation, used as a stream, as a channel throughout his journey, as he's journeying to different parts of Canaan and marking them as altars for the Lord and dedicating them back to them, because that's the land that his descendants will have. There was something also that I was doing in research that I loved, and so I'm just going to include this, but it talked about how, in being the channel and stream, right, when you think about how channels and streams, they function, and how water comes, and like how like the ground has to be dug up in a certain way for the water to be there. And so they were kind of saying how even the illustration of that, of how Abraham had allowed his heart to be excavated by God, that would allow an irrigation ditch to be dug, right? So even him being the stream, like his heart had to be excavated, meaning all of that, like extra idolatry and things that he that knew and was around within the land of his father and the land of his family, all that had to be dug out. You know what I mean? And in digging that out, it was digging a ditch for irrigation, for water, right, for the living water coming from God to flow into Abraham, which then would make him a stream and channel that flowed through each part of Canaan that he marked in as territory and dedication back to God, right? And so they talked about how he had to continuously catch the constant flow of the stream of God, right? And then from that flowed through him. It talked about how God used him also as Abraham as an excavator, right? He was digging permanent irrigation ditches throughout the land of Canaan that would then be the outpouring and moving of God. And so that was like the altars that he erected, right? He would claim that place and channel so that all water flowing would be from the master source, which is God, right? And not mixed sources or other mixed sources of streams of water. And so each channel that he dug, meaning each journey he took, and when he stopped and made an altar, was a channel of purity by way of his actions and devotion, and not channels of pollution. And so I really loved that illustration. I really loved how the author kind of really thought about that intentionally when it comes to, you know, the channel and what that meant, and that sign. So we're going to go to verse 10, because we're going to get into Reu, which is the next patriarch, and how Reu played a part again in this beginning commissioning of Abram. So verse 10 says, "Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land." And so Reu means to associate with or be a friend or a companion. There's some also other root words or root derivatives of Reu, which is Rea, Reu, Rei, Ra'ah. And it just pretty much means neighbor, friend, good pleasure, goodwill, a friend, companion. Ra'ah means to shepherd, tend, or pasture or feed. Ra'ah means to associate with, so to cultivate, to keep company. And so as Abram is journeying through, we're also seeing how this covenant that was held from his forefathers, right? All the patriarchs that I've mentioned as I'm mentioning this, the patriarchs within this thing, how it was maintained through the covenant that was established between God, right, and Noah. And also the faithfulness, right, that made Abraham a friend of God. Reu, which was the patriarch, kind of signified in his generation of that generation being a friend of God, being a companion of God, right? Also calling for to be a shepherd, right? So Reu was given the responsibility of being they were already shepherding, but it was like a critical and pivot into being a shepherd, right? Not only tending to the pasture of his heart and his devotion and dedication, but also making sure that his family, right? The family and the lineage that was under him was fed spiritually, right? They had that nutrition. And so, Abraham erected altars and dedication and worship to God. So he was a friend of God. This showed that he was a companion. He was associated with God, and was cultivated in being good, right? Pleasurable company in the presence of God. And God was the shepherd over Abraham's life. And then Abraham was the shepherd of the pastures of the land, which is the promised land, which would then bring the forthcoming of the great shepherd, right? And so, yeah, pretty much as a shepherd, Abram was tending to business. As he was making his way, he was tending to business, and he was tending to the business of God. And so, because of that, God ensured that Abram was fed and nurtured. So now we're going to get into Serug, which is the next patriarch, and how this played a part in Abram's life. And so, kind of to give a little bit more context, so Serug was born 187 years after the flood, and he died 427 years. After the flood, and died 427 years after that, right? So Serug is a key figure in biblical chronology that places Abraham's birth just 2 generations later. So Serug is literally 2 generations away from Abraham, which Abraham marks like a pillar in the next phase of the promise, which is what we're talking about. And so Serug was like, you're 2 generations away from a revelation, not only revelation, but also a form of the first deliverer, right, to be born, that would take on the commissioning of navigating, being that channel that would go out, scope the land, mark the land, dedicate the land back to God, like that whole journey, right? And so, yeah, so he was close. It was like really close in proximity to the promise. Now, this is important because Serug, that generation, that sign, that marker was like, you're actually really close to the promise, to a manifestation of the promise that was promised, right? It was also a monumental marker for Abraham, because Abraham was also in relation to Serug 2 generations from his promise. And I had to do a little bit of extra research on this, but also Serug means tendril and patriarch. And so again, so Serug was born, and he was like, from him, it was 2 generations from Abraham being born. And Abraham, we're already explaining what he was called. He was called a renowned man, a mighty man, a great nation. All the nations and families from him will be blessed, right? So he really took on this great responsibility and great honor. And so Serug was born literally 2 generations before him. And so how this plays a part in Abraham's life is because he's already journeyed. I mean, we're only in chapter 12, we're only 10 verses in, and you see how Abraham, just in 10 verses, has literally journeyed through the life and signs of every patriarch before him. And so now he's just literally 2 generations away from his promise, right? The promise of him being a great nation, right? Because at this time, I don't think that I've mentioned it because that was in the last teaching, but at this time, Abraham did not have any kids. Him and his wife, Sarah, did not have any kids. She was barren, right? And so, yeah, so there was a promise for him to make him a great nation, and that all nations and families would be blessed from him. Well, how do you be a great nation if you don't have kids, right? And so this was a spiritual and natural sign that Abraham was also 2 generations from his promise. And when you talk about Serug also meaning tendril, so they were talking about the intertwining. So at that point, in Serug for his generation, it was the intertwining, the intermeshing, the bringing together, right? And you think about with him being 2 generations off, like there was just a complete a completion that was coming together, right? There was intertwining not only with the will of God and the purpose of God, but how that generation, how that lineage was continuously being intertwined within the will of God. And so there was specific years. I also, in this, because I was like, okay, so he was 2 generations off, and in the Bible it gives you specific numbers, and I know that, like, whenever it gives you details, it's telling you something, right? So I was like, okay, what does this mean? So I did some extra research because I really tried to figure out, like, what this means. I was like, okay, if Serug was 2 generations, like, literally Serug's son was the next patriarch, then after him, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, so what does this mean? And then also, did this pattern play a part in Abram being 2 generations from his promise of being a great nation, which that mean he had to be a father? And by now he didn't have any children. So I went and looked back at all of the patriarchs that we mentioned, and I looked at how old they were when they had their children, right? Because I just needed to see, like, what the numbers were saying. I needed to look at, you know, okay, it was 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, right? 10 generations. I'm like, so let me look at, like, when their children were born. So I noticed a pattern, right? So we're going to start with Shem, right? And starting with Shem was 100 years old when his son Arpachshad was born, right? So then Arpachshad was 35 years old when Salah was born. Salah was 30 years old when Aver was born. Aver was 34 when Peleg was born. Peleg was 30 when Ruah was born. Ruah was 32 when Serug was born. Serug was 30 when Nahor was born. Nahor was 29 when Terah was born, which was Abraham's father. And then Terah was 70 when Abraham was born. So I noticed that Shem was 100. The rest of them were like 30s, right? There was one who was like 29, but they all ranged from like 30 to 35. But Terah was 70. So I'm like, okay, like, what's going on here? So then I did some extra research, and I was like, okay, so if Terah was 70 when Abraham was born, how old was Abraham when eventually he did have a son, right? He had 2, but he had, like, the chosen, the promised son that would make him a great nation, Isaac, was born. So if Abraham was 100. So when you think about it, Shem was 100 when Arpachshad was born, and Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. So the numbers kind of repeat themselves in a way. It's actually kind of interesting. So then I kind of went into more research with Serug, because it also meant tendril. It meant to intertwine and to weave. And so when I looked at all the numbers, when I looked at all the ages, when I just kind of just played with the numbers, because I love playing with numbers, the intertwining and weaving of the descendants of Abraham into the lineage of his son. And also it was illustrating the 2 truths at the time. So you have the intertwining of the lineages, right? The lineage of Abram into the will of God, right? Which is the promise of a Messiah that was to come. And then you also had this intertwining, interlocking that was happening, that was also illustrating 2 truths, right? It was the truth of power, which was like the strength of God, his provision, his divine separation, just everything I kind of mentioned with each lineage, which each generation, and what that sign, what those spiritual and natural signs meant. And then you also had the power of penalty. Again, there was a lot of corporate grief. There was a breach of covenant. There was a lot of brokenness with that. And so the power of penalty was the bondage of sin that the rest of his family was in, right? So there was 2 truths kind of playing out as all these things are intertwining together. And so, yeah, so we have Nahor and Terah. So I'm going to read okay, so we are going to jump ahead to verse 17 through 19 just to illustrate Nahor. So 17 says, so this is I'm getting kind of ahead of myself in terms of the tension, but we'll come back to the tension. But pretty much, long story short, Abram sells his wife Sarah to Pharaoh, and because he says, like, oh, we're sister and brother, we're not husband and wife, because Abram's like, you're so beautiful, they'll kill me because they want you. And they go along with it. Then God sends a plague. And so now we at verse 17, where it says, but the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say that she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. And so Nahor means snore, right? It means to, there is also a derivative word, nakar, which means to snort, to snore, to breathe heavily. So they kind of talked about, I had to do some research on this, but they kind of touched on the snoring isn't necessarily like, you know, when you go to bed and you hear people snore. No, it's more so like a snort sound that a horse makes. It's a specific sound, like a snorting sound that a horse makes, but it's not like weird, or, you know, like sometimes like animals just make weird noises and you're like, okay, that was kind of weird. But it actually meant, it was like a certain way that they snort within their nostrils, but it's actually a sign of war. And so, you know, soldiers and even people knew, like, okay, when we hear these horses snort or make this certain breathing of heavy and snort sound, it actually means a sign of war. It means that a sign of war is here, or impeding judgment is near. And so this, when I talk about in terms of the plague that was on Pharaoh's house, it also illustrated the patriarch of Nahor, which was Abram's grandfather, because at that time, with his generation, his sign was the snort of the horse. That meant that it was a sign of war, that impeding judgment is here, war is here, right? It's time to go to battle. And so when you talk about the divine separation that happened, right, when you talk about the divine justice, right, the provisions of God, and we talked about kind of the patriarch before that, where there was two ruling truths of power going on. There was the strength and power of God, and there's also the strength of the power of penalty, which was the bondage to sin that his descendants and other descendants were in. And so when it comes to the sign of war, this snort that was coming out of the nostrils of the horse, right, it was a signifying signal that it is time for war, right? There had to be a judgment for the breach of covenant, right? There had to be a judgment for the penalty of sin, of the bondage of sin that people were in. And so this signified the war of the Lord, that judgment was here. And you see that highlighted because Pharaoh took Sarah, because she was part of the covenant and the promise of God. Now, though God told Abram, I'm going to make you a great nation, I also did some extra research, and I think I talked about it in the last teaching, but they were already married. So they were married before they even moved, right? So, and because Abram feared the Lord, he was monogamous, meaning it was just him and Sarah. Like, they was not mixing, you know, so they did not have other people in their bedroom, right? Later, some happened, right? But for this specific point in time of his commissioning, he was monogamous. And everybody else, they wasn't monogamous. They weren't, they took themselves as many wives, but Abraham wasn't. So there was a specific, that's also why, they were used, their marriage was used, and so that's why there was war, and there was an impeding judgment upon Pharaoh, the house of Pharaoh, and a sign of war is because there was a wrath of God coming and unleashed among Pharaoh, right, for this time. And so, let me just, excuse me. Now, the reaction that causes is because, again, Pharaoh took upon Sarah. So, again, they were monogamous. They were in a marriage that was conducive, favorable, and in devotion to God. And so they were not only just in covenant with each other, they were in covenant with the Lord, and he was using the fruitfulness of their marriage, the favorability of their marriage, to bring about the promise of them being of Abram being a great nation. And so that also meant the womb of Sarai at the time was of prominence, of great value, and it was tied to that promise. And so her being in the house of Pharaoh would mean she was a harem, and his harem, she was a concubine. And the Lord's like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I'm sending plagues on your house. Let her go. And so that's what I just read, right? And so a little quick note that I said was Nahor is actually mentioned twice. Now, it's two different people though. So Nahor was the grandfather, and that's the generation that I'm talking about. But also Abraham's brother was named Nahor. So Nahor, his son Terah, which is Abraham's father, named one of his sons after his father. And so it says that Nahor, this is what I kind of summarized. Nahor was more than a footnote. He embodied the tension between the election and common grace. His descendants become essential conduits for God's unfolding plan, proving that divine sovereignty harmonizes both dispersion and reunion, separation and a sanctified return. And so you have this loud snort that went out, right? This loud snort from a horse that signified war and impeding judgment is here. But also Nahor symbolized the harmony, right, of sovereignty, where there's dispersion, meaning everyone's dispersed, right? We talked about the Tower of Babel. So it kind of continues to illustrate what happened between their family, right? Because they were all family, and how there was such dispersion, right? And the people that were bound to sin, right? They lived those lives. And so there caused a great separation and great division, right? But it also, in this great separation and great division, there also was a reunion. And so Nahor symbolized how the reunion and sanctified return, and the communion of what was dispersed, what was separated. And so this is also kind of demonstrated, again, with a little bit of research, because Nahor, who was Abraham's brother, who was named after his grandfather, his great-grandfather, actually stayed in Haran. So when Abraham went to Haran with his dad, it was him, his wife, Sarah, his cousin Lot, and then his brother Nahor. Now, they had another brother, but he died. And Lot was the son of that other brother that ended up dying. And so what happened was Abram, Lot, and Sarai, they went to Canaan, but Abram's brother Nahor stayed in Haran and lived there, right? But later on in the story, when Abram actually has the son that he was promised, Isaac needed a wife, and he couldn't just have any other wife. He couldn't have foreign wives, because he had to, one, keep the lineage and the bloodline, because their bloodline was pure. Because they intermarried, but they didn't marry like sister, brother. It was like, okay, maybe half sister, aunt, things like that. So their bloodline was pure, their bloodline was intact. And so marrying someone of another heritage and or culture was forbidden. Especially certain heritages and cultures were just forbidden, right? To keep the bloodline pure, to keep the lineage pure. And so his son Isaac would need a wife, right? And so Abraham ends up actually sending his servant back to Haran, right, which is the home of his father, right, the home of his people, and to find a wife for Isaac, because it had to be within their family. And so Isaac ended up marrying Rebecca, which is Nahor, his brother's daughter. And she becomes the wife of Isaac. And so it kind of illustrates, again, this great return, right? This reunion of what was dispersed. So Nahor and Abram were dispersed, right? They were separated. But yet then there was later on, through their children, was the illustration of a sanctified reunion and return, right? Back to each other through the marriages of their children. All under, again, the covenant of God, because his son Isaac would then take on and be the patriarch that continues the covenant of God. And so we have Terah, or Terach. That is Abram's dad. And so how he plays a role in this, there's so many layers to this, and there's so many layers, but it's so good because, okay, so I looked up his name, and these are, I don't really know if this is what it really means. I can't tell you. Like, I remember I used the concordance. So whatever the concordance said, that's what I used. But it said that Terach meant traveler, wanderer. And some of the other translations, it said delay, or like a white mountain goat. In Aramaic, it says that it meant to breathe, like literally just like breathe, right? And so it says the denominative verb from the noun ruah in Aramaic, which means wind, breath, or spirit. It's a collective force of wind. And so when it talks about the only breathing, it's like when you're just like standing somewhere, you're not just like standing and breathing, but it's like, it's I can't even put into words, but it's a specific force of wind of breathing, right? Or breathing upon something. It also talks about whether it's like delaying of a specific event, where it's like maybe announcing announcing a departure or procedure. And then it also kind of gave context to wandering, aimlessly wandering around, aimlessly traveling, right? And so, yeah, so you have the layer of Terah, his dad, being a wanderer, a traveler, which when you think about how he left, and it didn't say why he left Ur to go to Canaan and end up settling in Haran, but he did. They had to wander, they had to travel, so they were wanderers. They were, going to a land that was not of their, of their culture, was not of what they were used to. And so we also talk about, because I kind of went more deep into the Aramaic word, because there wasn't much really Hebrew terminology for Torah. They just had more context in terms of Aramaic, which is another language. And it talked about how the derivative is ruah, which means a wind, breath, spirit. I know that ruach is a derivative of that word, which means the breath of God, right? And so it kind of talked about the other derivatives of ruah, which is raya, which means a scent or a fragrance. Rhea is another derivative of that word, which means to detect or produce a scent or fragrance. You have ra'ah, which means to convey being in a wide or spacious, being like in a wider spacious space, and like more of like a sense of relief from confinement. So it's kind of like just freedom, right? But it's kind of a liberating freedom where you're no longer confined and you're in such an open space. You have riwa, which means space, an interval, respite, and relief. And then you have riwaha, which means respite and relief. And so when you think about Terah, right? There's so many dimensions to what Abram's father meant, what his generation meant, what the signs and patterns meant. Also in the journey that they took with him, right? He took them on a journey, even though they didn't make it to Canaan, and he ended up settling in Haran and dying. He took them on a journey. And so with them being wanderers, right? So, okay, I'm going to break it down like this. So first, his leadership, right? So Terah's leadership was rooted in freedom and a fresh start, and a relief from the confinement of a land that was full of idolatry. Now, when you add on the context of layer of Terah's son, which is Abraham's brother, died, right? But he left a son, but he died. And so this kind of like this new start kind of was a fresh start for Terah, right? Leaving the land of which he known for something else that was new and unknown. Also in terms of like wandering, being in a wide space, not being confined, having freedom. So Terah was taking his family from Ur and journeying to an I did some research. It was the infamous trade route that led to Canaan. So it was an illustration of them being wanderers in lands, right? And when it talked about the trade route, it was an infamous trade route that was used for trade in between the regions, in between Canaan and some of the other regions. And so they were in like very wide open spaces, right? It was nothing but road. It was nothing but dirt. You know, it was nothing but chance and opportunity ahead. And so they had freedom all around them, being resilient, almost as it said, another meaning for Terah or Tarok is the white mountain goat. So I did a little bit of research on the white mountain goat. And pretty much it's a goat that is resilient. It can survive. I mean, it has such unique and distinct survival tactics to how to survive in the mountains with different predators and things like that. And so thinking about how Terah displayed the resilience of a white mountain goat to journey through territory that could be foreign, you know, where there was a lot of things. There were a lot of predators, other foreigners, things that they might have or could have encountered, but he was still resilient in taking his family. Now, they also kind of labeled, especially within the Hebrew concordance, that they were kind of uncertain. There were uncertain derivatives. Most of the derivatives that came for Tarok was through Aramaic. And so they couldn't really find out where Tarok came from, where it ties to. And so this also kind of speaks to not really having a specific derivative in Hebrew, where the uncertainty of the journey of Terah when he took his family into journeying to Canaan and ended up staying in Haran. And so it kind of also illustrates the journey of Abraham when he was commissioned. He just didn't know where he was going. God told him, I have already chosen the land for you and I'll tell you, but still there was a lot of uncertainty with that, not knowing like where this came from, things like that. And so also, when we talk about the breath, right, the wind blowing, Terah also symbolized the breath of God, the wind that was blowing as a collective force that forced them into freedom. So Terah making that journey, and I did some research and they said they don't really know what or why that he picked up his family. Again, there was a lot of speculation and or traditional talk and passing down of history that, you know, he was also into idolatry and witchcraft and he made the figurines and things like that. So I don't really know for sure, you know, what he was thinking or what happened if the God came to him, like, or whatever. So, but however, Terah kind of symbolized the breath of God, the force of wind of God blowing them into freedom, right? Blowing them into the freedom and the next step of the promise. And then they kind of also broken down in my research that they said that from where they were in Ur to Canaan, so when they traveled 500 miles. And the guy said they were like 500 miles from Canaan. And then I guess he had stopped and ended up going. Canaan was more south, but instead Terah like went more north. And that's how he ended up in Haran. Now, I kind of did a little bit of research, but that's kind of what they said. I also kind of looked at like the trade route and things like that. It's kind of I can read like some of those ancient maps, but it's kind of difficult because a lot of those names, like they're not named that anymore. They have a little bit more modern names. So it was kind of interesting though, tracking the journey. And so it kind of mentioned about how Terah, even on his journey, was kind of at a crossroads because again, like his son died, right? So his son had died in Ur and he had to leave, but then also like leaving his family, leaving the land he knows, leaving the traditions, having an unknown journey ahead, not knowing what he's going to come against, what's going to come against him, what he's going to face, things like that. And so there was like a crossroads, right? He had to decide if he's going to continue to Canaan or if he's going to detour. And he ended up taking the detour to Haran. And he settled there, said that they settled there. Now, what I thought was interesting was the illustration of what that looked like. Because yes, he was a sign of the breath and the wind of God, forcing them into freedom, right? Forcing them out of the land into a new land, into a land that God had allotted. He separated, he gave division, and provision for it, right? And it kind of was interesting seeing the parallel illustration of how Terah was at a crossroads. Like, should I continue to Canaan? Should I go somewhere else? And he ended up choosing Haran and settling there, right? So he was a wanderer that ended up settling in a place where he would continue to wander, right? And up until his death. And it's funny because Terah is also a campsite, and it's a place. And it's actually the same campsite and place that the children of Israel, which is the descendant of Terah, which is the descendant of Abraham, which is the remnant, right? The land that Abraham was putting the altars at and going throughout Canaan that I was just talking about earlier. Those, his descendants, those people, yes, that remnant would then be and stay at the campsite of Terah. It was the name of a campsite that they stayed in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, they were wanderers. They were travelers. So it's interesting how Abram had, Terah illustrated this, and then Abram carried it on by being a wanderer, right? Going through the land of Canaan, wandering, right? And then how, Terah got to this decision-making, this place of decision-making, this place of crossroads. And he decided to go against what he knew he needed to do and settle somewhere else. And it's interesting to see like how that we talk about familial leadership and how Abraham was able to go forth and make it to Canaan because he had seen the leadership of his father that took the initiative to pack them up and lead them on the road to Canaan, though they detoured into Haran. And so you also see like these decisions and things that were made in these past patriarchs then play again in the descendants, because years and generations down the line, those descendants that came from Terah, that came from Abraham, that is a part of the remnant that was saved, end up being wanderers, end up being travelers, end up being at a crossroad where they had to make a decision, end up being at the place of Terah, right? End up being within the wilderness, end up being in a place of wandering and traveling, on their way to freedom, venturing to freedom, right? That in-between place. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Like, I didn't realize what that meant. But pretty much, yeah, Terah signified a place of remembrance of the crossroad. So therefore, the children of Israel, their forefather Terah, which was Abram's dad, his journey of uncertainty in traveling through a specific destination, but also feeling like a wanderer, for going from place to place. And this is also kind of referenced in Numbers 33:27. So Terah got Abram halfway. And then Abram had to finish the journey. And so that's when we kind of talk about generational leadership and how generational leadership influences the decision making. And how Terah deciding to settle in Haran instead of Canaan, again, pops back up generations down the line, not even generations on the line, Abraham repeats it as we go into the tension that he felt within Pharaoh and Egypt, because Abraham ends up repeating that same mistake that his father made. And I'm going to show you exactly what that is. So Terah ended up staying in Haran instead of going to Canaan. Well, we talked about in the verse where God told Abraham to go. And in verse 9, it says he journeyed going on still toward the south. So as he was journeying on to the south, there was a great famine in the land, and Abram ended up going down to Egypt to dwell. So he was thinking, oh, this is temporary, right? Same thing his dad was thinking, oh, this is temporary, I can go to Haran. And then because there was a great famine in the land, and it said it was severe famine, so it was a really severe famine. He just thought like, oh, I'll just go there temporarily and I'll be okay, right? Wrong. So let's get into it. So we're going to actually break down now the tension. So this is where Abraham and Pharaoh come face to face. Okay. So we're going to, just to recap, just to make sure you're with me. So the commissioning landed Abraham in a severe famine. He was still journeying south as God had commanded him, right? But he came across a severe famine that was within Canaan. And so he decided to go to Egypt temporarily, just as his dad decided to go to Haran temporarily, and he settled there, just like his dad settled in Haran. Talk about generational leadership and how those specific decisions impact the decision making of the ones that come after us, right? This tells us a few things. So he was still obedient because it led him to a place of tension. So in this, okay, so it's almost like someone says, go right, you go right, and then there's construction. Not only is there construction, there's a broken bridge, so you can't really cross, right? So this was the place of tension. This was a place of testing for Abraham. So Abraham wondered how he'd be able to maintain what he had, right? Because he did still have resources and things like that, but when there's a severe famine, that's anyone thinking like, okay, so how am I going to maintain what I have? Especially being on the outskirts in Canaan. So it seemed like Egypt seemed like a prevalent place for him to go, because it's like, okay, he knew they had power. He knew they had riches. At this time, Egypt was a dynasty. So they weren't just a kingdom. They weren't just a nation. They were a dynasty. So that means that they had power for centuries, right? And they were big, and it was within, especially for Egypt, within the family, within a certain lineage. And so they had power and prominence and dominion, right? So that does seem like, if you think about it, like, oh, that seems like a reasonable thing. Like, I'll just settle here. I mean, there's so many times I can think of where I'm like, oh, I'll just do this temporarily and this will help me get over, right? It's kind of just the normal way of thinking, right? It seemed like more of an obvious choice for him. However, he was repeating the same choice his father did. Now, the choice that his father made ended up causing him to die there, right, and never making it to Canaan. However, the story played out a little bit different for Abraham because of the promise that we had read earlier in chapter 12. And so this is just something to note as well, of like, sometimes we take a detour and make temporary places in spaces where we're not supposed to be. And with that comes more tough trials, because we take things into our own hands and lead with our own understanding. And so we think preservation at times is within proximity to something. So I can preserve because I'm in proximity to X, Y, and Z, where we are actually preserved when we are obedient and diligent to the original instruction we were given, right? And so him setting up in Egypt temporarily seemed financially, right, responsible. You could say it was economically wise. He was doing, good. He was a patriarch, so, the men held the power. So it was like, oh, so he was really stewarding his family well. But what Abraham didn't know was that this temporary settlement, right, this temporary decision would be the battleground chosen for the wrestling of his destiny and promise. So he was unaware of the opposition that was lurking. He was aware of the deities and idol worship and things like that of Egypt, and everyone knew about that. The practices, they were all common to him because that's where he came from as well. And however, what he didn't know was that the altar that was preserved by the rule and reign of Pharaoh and the deities were looking for dominance. Now, you could say like, well, Pharaohs, they were rich, they had power, they had so much dominance. But there's a specific type of dominance that they were looking for that they could not, that they had already obtained all the other types of dominance and riches, right? And so they were looking for a specific type of dominance and control within the earth. And they knew they had to ravish and destroy the remnants, meaning the people that were left to survive. So when we talk about the lineage leading up to Abraham, right, Noah was saved. And I went through all the patriarchs, right, through that. So they were like the starting of the remnant, right? So the remnant is the people or the thing that is saved, that is left over, that is surviving. When we talk about Noah, again, there was a great flood, right, that came. And so Noah was the remnant that was left. Him and his family was the remnant that was left, right, along with some animals. They were the remnant that was left. And so this type of specific dominion that Pharaoh and the deities that Pharaoh served, they were looking for the remnant, because they knew that with the remnant there's a promise, right? And so when you talk about dominance, when you talk about power, when you talk about governance, there's a certain power, there's a certain acclamation to power that they can acquire, again, through money, using money as a tool, resources, networking, things like that, being a part in proximity to powerful families, all that kind of stuff, right? There's dominance within that. But then we're talking about dominance on a spiritual level. And so I know a lot of people don't want to mix politics and religion or religion with a lot of other things, but I think I have to let you know, like, everything is rooted in religion. When we talked about ancient Egypt within my first Egypt teaching of the Pharaohs versus the Israelites, I broke down why it was important to know how ancient Egypt was so prominent, how they rose to power. It was through religion. It was through religious practice. It was through worship. It was through worship to deities. It was through the managing of altars with these deities. It was through sacrifice. They sacrificed humans. They sacrificed animals. They sacrificed just about whatever they needed to sacrifice. Even Pharaoh having to give of his seed, meaning ejaculate into the Nile, because the deity within that Nile required his seed. So it required him to pour out his seed yearly for the flood and all these other things to commence, for the Nile to be of a resource for him. So when you talk about the altar of dominance and control that Pharaoh was looking for, he had everything already. He had the women, the concubines, he had the power, but he was looking for a specific type of power that he can only have if the remnant is destroyed, if the remnant is delayed. Now, this remnant is specifically set aside, it's specifically chosen, it's specifically preserved to survive, right? Because with that comes that of a promise, comes that of a bigger destiny, comes that of a deliverer, like even Moses being a deliverer. I think we talked about in the other live teaching with the children of Israel, how Joseph rose up, which is from the lineage and descendant of Abraham, to be a deliverer. How Moses rise up. So there was different deliverers within the time that came and that carried the promise forward, right? Of there being a great deliverer, a great restorer, a great Messiah. But they had to have pivotal patriarchs that rose up in power. To do that, you have to have a remnant. And to have a remnant, you have to have specific dedication to God, right? And so, that's what they were looking for. That's what the altar, that's what the deities, that's what Pharaoh was looking for. Pharaoh had already acquired all the other things, but they were looking for the remnant, because they knew that if they could destroy and delay the remnant, if they knew that they could take the remnant under the oppressive systems of Pharaoh, because Pharaoh's a system, it's an oppressive system, if they could take the remnant and oppress them in such a way, it would delay and extract their destiny from them, right? And so that the remnant wouldn't rise up, right? So that the great Messiah, the great deliverer would not rise up, right? It also wanted to taint the bloodline. And so, okay, we're getting ready to get into some good stuff. Make sure that I'm explaining everything so you can really understand how this is all connected. Okay, so now we're going to start from verse 11 through 13. Still Genesis chapter 12. So it says, and it came to pass when he was, this is Abraham, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarah, his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. Okay, so this is important, right? We kind of talked about monogamy in the sense of Abraham and Sarah's devotion to God. And so that required, their marriage was pure, right? It also, when we talk about, Sarah's beauty, her countenance, wasn't just external. It was also internal. She had a certain capacity. Like, she was chosen not just because of her beauty, right? And even the layer of her beauty, and her still having and being such beautiful even in an older age, because at this time the vitality of humanity had decreased. Because before, like, Noah didn't die till he was 950 years old, so they was living a long time. But because, again, of the breach of covenant and just all this idolatry, the longevity and vitality of the life of humankind had decreased to 120 years. Okay, so Abraham was 75 when he left Haran, right? So that meant Sarai was in her like 60s. And so it kind of mentioned how her beauty was undeniable, right? So there was inwardly and outwardly, as I had mentioned. This speaks also to the preservation of her youth and vitality, that even in her mature age of 60, that she was beautiful like that. When you talk about the countenance also being inwardly, it meant that she held a special kind of character, something that was not a common amongst the women within that time. And it also kind of speaks to Esther why she was chosen, and why what I'm getting ready to talk about happened. Because he had told her, say that you're my sister and not my wife, right? Now we're going to talk about, again, she was barren, they had no children. But when we talk about, again, why all of this tension happened with him selling her to Pharaoh, because even though the promise was for Abraham, she was a part of the promise, right? Because of her womb. And so when we talk about remnants, we're also talking about fertility. This is the Pharaoh of that's coming to ravish the remnants, because he's coming to ravish the fertility. He wants the fertility rights, because if he can get the womb, he'll get the deliverer. He'll be able to delay the deliverer coming. He'll be able to kill the deliverer. He'll be able to cause other wombs to be barren and shut up, or kill babies, so that the deliverer does not come, so that the promise does not come to pass. And so fertility and remnants go hand in hand, and that is what this Pharaoh is after. And so, yeah, she had a promise to be a mother, even though she was barren at the time. So the preservation of her youth and vitality and her beauty, even in her mature age, because again, they weren't living that long anymore, showed how God was preserving her and the remnant of her, even in her womb, even though she was barren, right? And her barrenness was not a curse, but a divine protection for God's promise to be fulfilled at a certain time. Now, mind you, God probably already knew that Abraham was going to sell his wife, and he didn't sell her not once, he sold her twice. There's another instance where he sold his wife the same way. And so the barrenness was purposeful. It had to be, because we'll get into that later. But also, Abraham knew the price of her beauty, also not only outwardly, but inwardly. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too. And so he knew that the Egyptians would kill him to acquire her. Again, when you think about a Pharaoh, when you think about the system of Pharaoh, when you think about Egyptians, it's always acquisition. They are always trying to acquire something. And so, so they also were related. So he wasn't lying, technically, because they are brother and sister. They're actually half brother and sister. So Sarah was Abraham's sister from his father's side. So she was his half sibling. But they were married. So it was like a partial lie, but still a lie nonetheless, and a deadly lie. So we'll get into verse 14 through 16, where it says, "So it was when Abram came into Egypt, and the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house." I said verse 16. "He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels." Okay, now let's talk about this, because this gets really good. So pretty much what this is saying is that when Sarah went into the house of Pharaoh, that's when she became Pharaoh's wife. Now, we're going to get into, I have to kind of tell you the Egyptian marriage traditions and customs so that you can understand why then the wrath of God came upon Pharaoh's household, right? And why this Pharaoh is linked to ravishing the remnants, and how the remnants is linked to fertility and the fertility rites, right? And the womb, and how all of this aligns. So pretty much Egyptians were monogamous, besides royalty, like besides pharaohs. It was most desirable, and also even though their marriages were arranged, they still thought of marriage to be something full of romance and happiness. And so a lot of the common marriages were also between older men and younger girls. And so even though, you had the depiction of beauty and happiness and love and romance, marriage was arranged, but it was a social contract. So it was a binding between the two individuals legally, rather than, it wasn't necessarily a religious right. In some religions, it's like, oh, marriage is a religious right that you have, right? But they didn't believe in that. They just thought, like, this is a legal binding contract. And by way of that, it's because it's how they were diligent when it comes to solidifying their social status, how they secured economic alliances, social rank, and wealth and political influence. This is even for like Egyptians that were commoners. And they made sure that marriage was mutually beneficial for the man and the woman, right? Now, the men had more rights, but the women still had power too. They were not left destitute. So that was a common thing. And so they would use marriage to protect their assets, right? And this literally was a contract. Like, they literally had to sign a contract. But they would protect their assets. This and also increased their social power, and it made them being able to be strategic. So that's why it was arranged, because they were allowed to be strategic. And it wasn't just because it was now like, oh, this beautiful couple. It was actually for what's to come and what comes beyond the couple, right? Into more of the familial networks and communities and alliances. So it was very business. So it's kind of like when you think about Bridgerton, when they would sell off their daughters to like the rich men and things like that. And it was very strategic. It was based on alliances, based on power. Like, we're going to welcome you into this familiar network and community and alliance to ensure that not only, like, yes, this bloodline continues, but then there's some power, there's some dominance, there's status, right? There's rank. And so the marriage contract, there was a contract. It documented each party's commitments in terms of property division, their dowries, and inheritance. So when a woman was married to a man, she was married to him as soon as she moved into the house. So when it says, let me go. It says, when the princes of Pharaoh saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and she was taken to Pharaoh's house, that means that Sarah became Pharaoh's wife right then and there. Because once a woman went into the man's house, they were married, right? As soon as she entered the house, they were married. Now, with that also came a dowry. So it says that Pharaoh was pleasurable. Not pleasurable, but was like pleasant, and treated Abraham well and gave him oxen and all these things, right? So that was part of the bride price. So with him giving him the donkeys and the oxen and the camels and the servants, right? That was Pharaoh paying the dowry, the bride price to Abram for Sarah to be his wife. Now, it says that the dowry and the responsibilities of whatever that looks like is agreed upon, and that's also part of the contract. So they pretty much signed a contract that, yes, take Sarah and this is what I'm going to give you in return, right? And so they also kind of talked about that marriage, within marriage, how they viewed sex and like purity kind of wasn't enforced or taboo. It was kind of just like a thing. Now we're going to get kind of the marriage traditions of royal, which would be Pharaoh, right? So we already know that when Sarah went into his house, she was automatically his wife. He paid Abraham a bride price for her. which was agreed upon. You know what I mean? They had to agree upon it, right? There is terms and conditions. Now, with the royal family, with Pharaoh being whoever Pharaoh was at that time, he could marry his sister or half-sister. So again, they weren't monogamous. That wasn't a thing because it was part of their kingship. It became part of their kingship duty to be polygamous and to have multiples. And also, intermarrying within family was discouraged upon other Egyptians. So only the royals could do it because they needed to keep their bloodline pure. And really, polygamy it was really a social, political, economic, systemic tool for alliances, ensuring political stability and expanding dynamic power. So this enabled Pharaoh to maintain lineage rights without compromising that, while also navigating the power dynamics, right, of the dynasty. And so Pharaoh had a primary wife, and then he had a lot of secondary wives. So of course, with any primary wife, they have a lot more privileges. They're more higher status, more higher in rank. They were always Egyptian. Like, there were a couple of references within research where they were like, yeah, there might have been some really prominent, Egyptian wives that were the primary wives that were talked about and also mentioned in history, that they might have been more of a foreign origin, but for the most part, all of the primary wives were Egyptian, because they were either their siblings or like half kin, or half siblings or like kin to the pharaoh. And then the primary wife resided primarily in the close proximity to Pharaoh, so within the king's chambers that they shared. And then also their children were prioritized when it came to inheritance and succession. Now, the secondary wives, which is what Sarah was, also, you have secondary wives, and they were also called concubines, right? They were also called the ornaments of the king, right? So you think about a tree and how a tree has so many ornaments. Think it's like that. They were like his decorations. Now, the secondary wives and concubines, part of the harem, they were a lower social and legal status. Their main roles were childbearing and strengthening influential familial connections. So I know a lot of people think like harems, like it's like all this sensual, sexual things, but not with Pharaoh. Like, of course, the sex was part of the duty because they needed to produce children for him. Even though those children had a lower status and like weren't as high ranked as the primary children, they still needed to produce children because that was a part of it. And then also, there was times where the secondary wives could gain favor and influence, but it also kind of just depends on, say if the primary wife did not birth Pharaoh a child and one of the secondary wives did, that's how they were able to gain favor, by birthing a male child. And also several male children. So the secondary wives, so when Sarah went into Pharaoh's house, she did not go to his king's chamber. She did not share a communal space with him. They actually lived in separate quarters. So you think about like the infrastructures of these houses, a lot of like the storage cities that Pharaoh built, where he had like his excess and overflow of all the things. They have these huge houses, right? Of course, the houses were dedicated to different deities, but like these huge houses. And so they lived on like a separate quarters of like the household, right? So they also had limited control over the different household affairs. And so all the children from the secondary wives, the harems, and the foreign queens and foreign princesses that Pharaoh acquired, they did not have the same rank and favor as the children from the primary wives. And so Sarah was part of Pharaoh's harem. So we're going to get into like kind of the symbolism and the customs of Pharaoh's harem, because it will also show you why there was such great judgment. Like why there was such judgment and war so soon. So the harems, they were also called, it was also called like a royal apartments. And so it was more so, again, like it was huge. Like these living chambers were huge, and so it was a multifaceted and complex world that encompassed politics, power, influence, and influence. This is where the foreign queens navigated intricate social dynamics. And so their focus and their main priority outside childbearing was dynasty building. And then, you know, the later half was the sensual indulgences and the things, whatever, you know, Pharaoh wanted. But it was really to safeguard the continuity of the dynasty continuing within that same lineage, within that same bloodline. And so they actually held a very heavy responsibility. And so this harem was, which Sarah was a part of, was categorized in 3 pillars, right? So you have the dynastic politics, right? So all the things political and things like that. You had the ceremonial life, and then you had the upbringing, which is the raising of royal children. And so who lived in these harems? So they had secondary wives. So he had secondary wives. He had concubines, which the concubines were always foreign. And they were not only foreign, like foreign princesses, things like that, or foreign queens, but they were also like of noble origin, meaning like they were also not just if they weren't a princess or queen, like they had like noblemen and things like that. So it'd be the daughters of foreign noblemen, like really high prominent women, right? It also in this, in the harem, which was in this complex, this second quarters, this different separate quarter, also had the royal children that these second wives and concubines had. And it was servants that lived there. They had tutors, they had nurses, they had officials who handled the administration of this compound, right? They had royal widows, like some of the widows that would die, like the other queens that were primary wives. If they're, you know, the other pharaoh would die, like they would go live there. And also any related or retired like courtsmen people. Let me scroll down. And so when you talk about the continuity of the dynasty building, kingdom building, also politics in the realms of like economics and things like that, like these women just were not laying around in a compound being taken care of by Pharaoh. And in my research, it said that it was quite costly to maintain, but the cost, the outcome was far greater than the cost, because these women were skilled. So they were very refined in their manners, right? They were educated in the skills and etiquette expected at court for them. They were educated and skilled in music, dance, literacy, religion, and also all the courtly protocols. And so they had skills for diplomacy, influence, and service, and all various royal households. And so they also not only had those skills, right, those technical, those really key transferable skills, they also had what was called a royal nursery. So they had skills for nurturing, right? It was kind of like a finishing school. That's what they kind of called it, where the daughters, right, the allies would come in. So once Pharaoh would acquire the daughter of you know, a prominent figure, or more concubines, or more other royal foreign women, the women would come into as like a nursery. They would come in and they would have to learn the Egyptian language. They would have to learn the religion. They would have to learn the culture. They would have to learn the dance. They would have to learn this etiquette. They would have etiquette. They would have to learn all the political and social, diplomatic things. And so that's also like what Sarah would have to do when she came into that, is learn that, right? And so it said that the girls raised in this harem were priestess. They were wives. They were diplomatic brides. They encompassed a lot in a wide range of royal and noble origin. And then it said that the boys raised in harem, that they end up becoming princes, governors, and future pharaohs, possibly, if Pharaoh didn't have one from his primary wife. And so you can see when it talked about the continuity of the dynasty, it wasn't just the head seat being in the seat of authority of the pharaoh, but it was also the courtsmen, the governors, the judges, the princes, like all of these diplomatic positions, all of these positions of authority is where the additional children from these foreign wives in harem and the concubine and all these secondary wives, they would then take upon these influential and authoritative positions, right, to continue Pharaoh, because they were part of Pharaoh's bloodline. So they wanted to continue to have his family in power. I thought it was interesting when they mentioned that the daughters from the first wives, that's the first wives of Pharaohs, were never sent to foreign men, because they thought of like their bloodline as being pure, so they thought it was beneath them. And it said that specifically that to send an Egyptian princess abroad would have implied equality or even submission to another monarch, an idea incompatible with the Egyptian vision of divine kingship. So they never sent their daughters to foreign men. Only Pharaoh acquired foreign women to be in his concubine, but he never sent his daughters. Never. Which I thought that was pretty interesting. And so yeah, this harem, the purpose of it. So this is when we're going to talk about fertility and why this Pharaoh was coming for the remnant, right? A specific remnant that it was searching in the midst of a famine. Like, there's famine in Canaan, so whenever a famine would hit, of course it's going to hit and impact surrounding areas and locations and nations. So the fact that there's a severe famine going on and Pharaoh's out here scouting for women, like, sir, you have enough secondary wives. You out here scouting for women in the midst of a famine. But also, why he was also doing that is because around this time too, when famine or tragedy, something like would hit, like, people would sell themselves. They would sell their daughters. They would sell, for survival. And so to him, it's like the perfect time to go ravishing, to go hunting, right? For whatever he wanted, right? This insatiable appetite to fulfill his divine kingship, to fulfill and have dominion and be the leader in foreign policy, right? And so, yeah, it was just weird to me. I was just like, there's a whole severe famine going on, and you are out here scouting for extra secondary wives and concubines. It's crazy, but when you think about it from a deeper level, you're like, oh, I understand. Like, if not, it's the perfect time, especially for someone in prominence, to do that, because it's like people are struggling. People are going to be selling themselves. Foreign kings are going to be looking for allies. They're going to be willing to sell things and sell themselves in ways that they never would have if not the famine happened. So, excuse me. He was in the perfect timing with that. And so pretty much the purpose of this is to have a vital dynastic, political, economic, and educational institution. That's what this harem was. These concubines and secondary wives, that was the purpose. It was an institution. And also to have a steady, the research was like, they had to have a steady supply of royal children, especially sons. It ensured that if there was the chances of producing a male heir, also it was a backup plan in case illness or something happened. And then also it kind of helped with the alliances, right? Because of the noble families, it all was facilitated through marriage. And so we're going to go on and read after he gave him all the donkeys and camels and stuff. So verse 17, it says, "But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house, the great plagues, because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, 'What is this that you have done to me? And why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her. Why did you say that she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way.' So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had." And so let's kind of get into this, right? So when we just got through talking about the harem, we just got through talking about the concubine, why it was important, why Pharaoh was looking, and then also why Sarah was sold, right, to Pharaoh. Now, women were the heart of Pharaoh's royal harem. The concubines, the secondary wives, everyone that he took on and acquired, they were the heart of his operation. They were the heart of his divine kingship, right? They were the heart of everything that he needed. Let me scroll down, because with these women, it was more than sex, right? It was because they would this compound was a nursery. It was a compound of vast people that lived within it, right? It was also self-contained, so it was a self-contained community, and also it was the ornaments of the king. So when you think about a tree and you think about Christmas tree and how you put ornaments on it, everyone's like, oh my god, I love the tree, I love the ornaments, oh, it's so pretty, yes, this is such a great tree, right? It's the same thing when you think about Pharaoh and how these women wear the ornaments of him. So it helped his acclamation of fame and power and position, that he would be able to acquire, you know, these big things. When you hear about companies being acquired for millions and billions of dollars, right? It's kind of the same thing of like, oh, he was able to conquer, you know, the daughter of so-and-so, you know, this king gave of his daughter, and so, you know what I mean? Like, so it was part of his diplomacy. It was part of his divine kingship. They were his ornaments. They were his, like, things that he could show off of his power. And so what was interesting when they said about the harem and even just the royal household, that they were bound to be loyal by blood and by duty. And so when you think about Sarah being taken in the same way that most of these other secondary wives and harems and concubines were taken, that meant that because she came under Pharaoh, now she was bound to his royal household by blood and by duty, right? And when we talk about blood, we talk about the sacrifice, right? We talk about the altar and the deities that Pharaoh would sacrifice to, right? And so now that meant that Sarah came under the blood that was shed on the altars for that deity, right? For the sacrifice, and also for the governance that was given and the prominence that was given to Pharaoh and the power that was given to Pharaoh. So she came up under the covenant, right? That was no longer the covenant of God, which facilitate the promise that God had promised, but now she came under another covenant, right? And then because she came under this covenant, and it was through blood, right? Not necessarily her having to shed blood, but through the rituals and things like that that Pharaoh gave of blood sacrifices to these deities. Now that meant that Sarah was of duty to this royal household due to Pharaoh. It also mentioned that marriage to Pharaoh. So everyone that married Pharaoh, it was not only a personal marriage, but also a ritual marriage. Like, it was a ritualistic marriage. And so when you talk about rituals and things like that, again, like being in contract to him through blood and also by duty, this was a ritualistic marriage. So she was under a whole different covenant, a whole different marriage. She was no longer in a monogamous marriage that was of dedication and of favor and favorable to the Lord and backed by a covenant with God. She was now under a covenant of many deities, right? Of many altars, under the oath of blood that was sacrificed by duty to Pharaoh. And now she was also under within a marriage that was part of the rituals of Pharaoh. Because again, this polygamy was part of his kingship. So it was required. It became a duty of him to marry out and marry as much and have as much, because that's how he was able to facilitate and, you know, do of his power and things like that and acquire more. And so it became a duty. So it's like, with that was part of the ritual. So she came under a whole different covenant of idolatry, right? That was no longer the covenant that she was under. Now, we talk about remnants. We talked about fertility, and I mentioned that, you know, the fertility is part of the remnant, right? And it mentioned that because the women were vital, he had to have wives. He had to have a lot of them. He had to have concubines. They were vital because childbearing, nurturing, the policies and things that they did, like all that kind of stuff. So he needed their fertility. The fertility of the woman was necessary and it was needed. It was part of the ritual. And so their fertility gave Pharaoh the security of his dynasty, not only just locally and centrally, but internationally. And so when you think about how Sarah then now became his wife, her fertility, meaning her womb, was now of duty to Pharaoh by blood on the altar and the covenant that Pharaoh had with the deities. And so her fertility then became a rite, a ritualistic rite of passage for Pharaoh, right? And also then became intertwined within the diplomacy and dynastic security and enhancing, expanding, and dominating. And so that is how he was. I was just about to say something, but no, I won't say that. That is how the plagues came, because she was no longer under the covenant that she was originally under, which was, monogamous, which was dedicated to God, which was set apart, which was divinely separated and set apart for God. Now she was under something that was desecrated, that was tainted, that was perverse, but then also under a whole other, under a full multiple deities that now had rights to her fertility, which means that had rights to her womb. Now, Sarah was barren. She was barren purposefully, because it was for a certain time that she was to give birth to Isaac, which wouldn't happen to some years later when, Abraham was 100 years old. So I thought about, had she not been barren and had Abraham still sold her, that her womb would not have been pure and would not have been what God would have needed to bring about the promise on Abraham's life. And so, yeah, there was only two ways to really become part of the harem. It was, great kings. They sent their daughters, everyone they had to Pharaoh, or it was by conquest. So either Pharaoh conquered and acquired you that way, or you were sent by way of, your family. So when we talk about this, we talk about the wrath and the plagues that were rained upon Pharaoh's household, that he ended up driving Abraham and Sarah out of Egypt. He was like, look, take everything, just go, right? It was justified because Abraham and Sarah, Abraham sold Sarah to Pharaoh, right? And so that trade, it just wasn't a trade of I get some donkeys, I get some oxen, and with him acquiring that, it then allowed him to sustain himself, right? Because he had already had lucrative riches, he already had provision, but he needed more because of the famine, and so that allowed him to sustain himself. However, he was trading his destiny, he was trading the promise, and he was trading Sarah's womb, right? The rights, the legal rights, right? Because we think about the legal markings, right? And the altars that he set up upon in Canaan. Well, he was trading the legal rights to Sarah's fertility, to her womb, to Pharaoh for some oxen. Now, if you know the story about how then she ended up getting pregnant with Isaac, and Abraham did become that great nation, you think about the weight of you becoming a great nation, that all households, everyone upon the earth will be blessed from you, and you trading that for some oxen, for some Egyptian servants, for some donkeys. The trade up is not that it's not adding up, right? And so the promise of Abraham, again, being a great nation, wasn't just for him. It was for his wife, Sarah, because she was a part of that. Her womb was a part of that. Her womb will be used, even though she was barren on purpose for this specific time, her womb will be used, right? Let's talk about her character, because when we talk about how the harem, how I mentioned, they weren't just beautiful women. They had to know how to talk, act, speak, teach. They were prominent. And so it kind of goes back into how I mentioned how Sarah's beauty just wasn't outwardly. It was also inwardly. She had a type of character of how she carried herself and the type of woman she was. So she kind of also just fit in with the I don't want to call her a prototype, but almost like the prototype of what Pharaoh was looking for when it comes to his harem, right? His concubines. However, God's hand was on Sarah to keep her womb closed for a certain amount for an appointed time. And in that, it preserved her vitality, her youthfulness, and her beauty, right? To be able to then bear a son when she was at 90 years old. She also, again, fit the type and characteristics of the woman that the royal harem had, and how they were taught and influential, right? And so we think about also going back to the promise at the beginning of the chapter when God said that he would curse anyone who curses Abraham. And so Sarah's marriage to Pharaoh, even though Abraham was given and blessed by Pharaoh, was actually still, he was blessed with provisions through Pharaoh, was still a curse to Abraham, because it was a curse against Abraham and the promise of Abraham, the promise on Abraham's life, right? It brought Sarah under a covenant that was no longer under the covenant of God, which means that she was no longer under the preservation, and she was still under the protection, but it brought her up under a different covenant, right? Which that covenant was against the covenant of God, which then would be a curse against Abraham. It also, in doing that, and Sarah being Pharaoh's wife, actually was also the acts of committing idolatry and adultery, right? Going against her marriage. And then also her fertility rights were under attack, and her womb would be used for destruction and not the promise. Because mind you, Pharaohs, they just used them for babies, and then from there it was dominion. And so her womb would have been used if she was not barren and gave forth a child to Pharaoh. Her womb and her fertility and the rite of passage of what the womb does, how it creates, how it multiplies, all of that, even like her astute in stature and her disposition, all of that, of totality of who she is, including the right to her womb, Pharaoh would have, and it would be used for destruction. It would not be used for good, right? Which would then undermine the promise of that all nations will be blessed under Abraham. So you can see as to why even that marriage was a curse to Abraham, though Pharaoh blessed him with many provisions. And so Sarah's vessel, meaning the totality of her body, and her womb would then no longer be pure, right? Which would then also be, and then she would no longer be Abraham's wife, meaning they would not live together, because she would be up in Pharaoh's house, in the compound. And so we kind of get into how then all of this is like, yeah, so Abraham selling his own wife was out of fear of being killed. So he ended up asking her to lie, and in return of them lying, he ended up selling her over to Pharaoh. Now, yes, Pharaoh does pay the customary bride price for Sarah to Abraham, and for the privilege of being able to take Sarah as his bride, which is also done like in the contract in terms and agreements. And they call it jeopardize. And I don't know, that sounds French. Jeopardize. That's what the type of contract is called. And so when Sarah moved into Pharaoh's house, she moved into the compound. That was the marriage ceremony, because a lot of times they didn't really have like these big grand ceremonies. They kind of had informal ceremonies, marriage ceremonies. And so, yeah, so then that's when the marriage between Pharaoh and Sarah became ritualistic. Sarah came under the idolatry and ritualistic worship of deities in which Pharaoh had covenants and active altars with. It also said like Egyptians, even though it was an arranged marriage, but they loved, happiness and romance and things like that. Marriage was also pivotal of not just of moving assets and, social rank and things like that, and happiness and romance, but it also was a form of love and romance on the earth, and then also in the afterlife, because they believed in the afterlife. So it was like, you're not marrying this person because of all these things, and yes, this might put you in a better spot and position socially and economically. It's also like, and you're marrying this person for eternity. And so when you add the element of like, okay, so Sarah was technically married to Pharaoh for eternity, because they'd be like, they highly believe that, if one spouse would die, that they would eventually meet each other in the afterlife. And so then they would be intertwined with each other even into eternity. And so you can also see how this was a curse against Abraham, which was a curse against God and what God had provided and wanted, and as far as the promise for Abraham and Sarah to have a child. that would bring about more promises for the remnant and keep and preserve the remnant and keep them safe, and was for their mere survival, was because with Sarah being Pharaoh's one of his secondary wives, she would be in an eternal marriage contract with Pharaoh. An eternal tie and bond. And this would then override the promise of God that was chosen specifically for Sarah. And then 2, of course, would be a legal binding contract, right? That she would have to abide by blood and by duty. And so when I looked at it, the scripture, when it talked about how the plagues came to Pharaoh's household, that doesn't mean that it was just like his primary household. That also meant that it was a secondary household. How I came to that conclusion was, well, first of all, let's go back. Because when the Pharaohs came, it just says his house plagued Pharaoh's house with great plagues. And it says Pharaoh called Abraham. So I was like, well, how do you know it was Abraham? But again, like, Pharaohs used, oracles and things like that in divination. So I'm pretty sure one of the oracles or, people in divination had told him why. But when you think about it from the perspective of what I told you about his harem and his secondary wives and all the concubines, the plague had to have hit them too, because they were part of his house. Even though they were a separate compound, they were also a part of his house and under his household. And it's like his first, yes, it would be detrimental if the primary family, like primary children, were impacted, but it'd be even more detrimental if the secondary family and all the other extra royal children, due to the extra marriages, were under attack and plague, because that was Pharaoh's nest egg. That was the epitome of the system of Pharaoh, of how the system continued. And so it wasn't just like, his first wife and their kids. Like, no, it was the household. So all of it. So like, again, that was courtsmen. That was a lot of people. But also I was like, yeah, this had to have hit also the secondary, the harem, because that was the life force of Pharaoh. And so, yeah, we're almost done. The little excerpt that I had said was Pharaoh was ravaging the remnant by acquiring wombs during this time from distant kingdoms from local lands and rulers. If he could get the womb of the lineage of the remnant would come out of, then he would have control. He then would be able to kill them or decide their fate and destiny. But he needed the wounds. And so the famine in Canaan, and also it being spread to other parts of the, that land, or, other territories being impacted, was the perfect leverage for him to do so. So kings, noblemen, governors, etc. would be looking to preserve their governance and rulership, and pawning their daughters to Pharaoh would ensure that they remained connected to a strong dynasty and a source of wealth. It also helped Pharaoh expand control, raise up offspring that would ensure that the system of Pharaoh continued. Continuity was the only goal. As long as the kingship of Pharaoh the kingship of Pharaoh was the only thing that Pharaoh knew, and the continuity of it was important. And also they knew that they had this power through the continuity of it, through their deities and the rituals. And so let me just go back to the verses 17 and 20, when Pharaoh found out that they were actually, husband and wife. And 2, he was like, yeah, get up out of here, take everything, right? Now when Pharaoh kicked them out in verse 20, that's him legally divorcing Sarah. So in my research, it said that divorces was just as easy as marriage. So when they knew they wanted to get married and the woman would move into the man's house, they were married automatically. And so when the woman would leave the house, they would be divorced. So it was very simple, just as them getting married. But Pharaoh, in verse 20 says, so Pharaoh commanded his men concerning Abraham, and they sent him away with his wife and all that they had, right? And so, so this was Pharaoh divorcing Sarah. So this was Pharaoh breaking that legal contract, that legal marking, and the rights he had to Sarah's womb by divorcing her. The plague happened so that Pharaoh would divorce Sarah, so that she would be able to be redeemed and come back under the original promise, right? And so, he released her from the spiritual covenant. And so divorce throughout this time also, there was no legal proceedings for divorce, and the marriage terms were decided based on the marriage contract. So remember when I said, like, Pharaoh had paid Abraham a dowry, like a bride price? Whatever they agreed upon would have been on contract and written down. So pretty much whatever, let me just read. So when Sarah moved into the house, that signified that the bride price was paid, right? And so Pharaoh kicking her out, including everything they had, was also the bride price. So whenever there was a divorce, they always said that they would not leave the bride destitute. And so whatever was agreed upon in the terms of the contract when they got married, that's what it would be. And then also the bride gets to keep the dowry, the bride price that was given to her family. So she gets to leave with that. And so that's why he allowed, because I was like, wait, so they still left with all, like, Abraham got to leave not only with what he came with, but what he acquired through Pharaoh by selling his wife. And that's because in their marriages, whatever bride price was paid, if they divorce, the woman gets to keep it. She doesn't have to pay it back. Allowing them to keep the dowry, that bride price that he gave Abraham, was the finality of the divorce, which is the whole point of the plagues, was to get her out of the divorce, get her out of that contract with Pharaoh. Now, we kind of talked about a lot, right? We talked about the tension. We talked about the journey of Abraham. We talked about the tension between him and Pharaoh. We kind of talked about the legalities, the marriage, the covenants, the altars. And so we're going to get into our next teaching, the effectiveness of an altar, because we've mentioned altars before throughout this whole teaching. And so, Abraham versus Pharaoh, Pharaoh versus Abraham, that just wasn't a man-to-man kind of thing. It was altar versus altar. I kind of talked about the legalities of the marriage, what that meant. And so it was actually the altar of God versus the altar of Pharaoh at work. And you see that the altar of God sent the plagues and changed the trajectory. And so the altar of God had more power than the altar of Pharaoh. And through these altars is backed by covenant. So you had Abraham's covenant with God, and then you had Pharaoh's covenant with deities. It wasn't just man versus man. It was altar versus altar. It was covenant versus covenant. It was priesthood versus priesthood. And so, yeah, we'll get more into that, but that's the live teaching for today. Pretty interesting. I did a lot of research, and I was like, it was just so good. Like, I was like, wow, I've never really looked at it like that. And I've heard the story plenty of times throughout my childhood, and I've just never looked at it from this point of view. And also an understanding of, like, why pharaohs are coming to ravish the remnants. It's just not just the remnant within itself. It's actually the survival and the preservation of the remnant, which is also facilitated by fertility. There is a birthright. There is a right to the womb, right? For the womb to continue to produce. And so if it can gain control of the womb, if it can take captive that womb, then it'll take captive of the destiny of the remnant, of the destiny of the deliverers that are supposed to rise up to continue to preserve and take on the mantle and responsibility of the remnant that was saved and preserved. And so it's good to kind of think about what this means, what this looks like, how it looks like in your life, in your time, thinking about even what this looks like in modern day. Like, is there any context and things that you can draw from that are happening now, or that maybe have happened 10 years ago, but now we're seeing it play out on this societal, social, economic stage, political stage now. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. Let me know if there's anything that you might have learned that might have stuck out that you didn't really think about before. Check out the other Pharaoh teachings. Check them out. There's also other live teachings that I've done that you can check out if you're wanting to get more deeper into, you know, what's happening, what's being said, things like that. And so, yeah, I thank you for tuning in, and I look